I'm Julia Zerniak. I'm an associate professor here, and it's with great pleasure that I introduce this afternoon's speaker, guest lecturer, Roger Sherman. Architect, urbanist, intellect, punster. And I think that will make sense, I'm sure, after his lecture. So founder and principal of Roger Sherman Architecture and Urban Design in Santa Monica. His work, which spans from both single and multifamily residences to large-scale public projects, utilizes design and planning strategies geared toward today's climate of rapid change. His firm has been the recipient of numerous awards. The most recent of these include AIA awards for Rail Yard Park in Santa Fe, Gateway Park in Toledo, and the 3-in-1 House in Santa Monica. The latter was also named Home of the Year by Architect Magazine in 2006. Roger considers himself most widely recognized for his landscape and planning work, which in addition to Rail Yard and Gateway Parks, includes Repark, an end-use plan for Freshkills landfill in Staten Island, part of the kind of competition event that went around the future of Freshkills, the West Hollywood Civic Center, and Transit-Oriented District, a TOD plan for North Hollywood in California. Perfect. In addition to his professional practice, Roger serves as co-director with Dana Cuff of City Lab, an urban design and research think tank at UCLA that was founded in the wake of Katrina and 9/11, dedicated to the development of more adaptive and agile planning practices designed to address the dynamic nature of today's metropolis. Also an adjunct associate professor in the UCLA Department of Architecture and Urban Design. He co-authored with Cuff and Bob Somel OZLA, New Forms of Community for LA's Holes, a proposal for Los Angeles 2106. Sherman is author of Under the Influence, Negotiating the Complex Logic of Urban Property, that's forthcoming from University of Minnesota Press. And previous to this, he organized, edited, and contributed to RE American Dream, 6 housing prototypes for LA, which is published by Princeton Architectural Press, and co-editor of Dense City, After Sprawl, a special edition of Lotus Documenti. His work also has been published in other edited volumes, as well as numerous other journals on contemporary urban design and theory, including Log, Praxis, Lotus International. He has taught widely, including at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, and now as a VC here at Syracuse, and has given extensive lectures, including one at MoMA's important 2001 conference, Things in the Making, Architecture, and the Pragmatist Imagination. Although I have known Roger and his work for some time, sometimes even competing against him, this semester is the first time we've taught together. Through this, I am bi-weekly treated to his sharp wit, his keen insight, and for his remarkable way of rethinking approaches to catalyzing change in the city. And I, for one, and I'm sure our students as well, have been thoroughly initiated to Roger's unique way of seeing the world. As I mentioned earlier, although he proclaims to be known more for his planning and landscape work, our travels to the Netherlands this semester with our students in studio certainly suggested another strong layer to his aptitudes. His passion, despite our fatigue and the evening's dropping temperatures, to visit one more project, even if it was Ben Van Berkel's Living Tomorrow. I don't know if you know that project. His orienteering skills we witnessed as he led us off-road, miles from the bus stop, through wet and soiled sheep pastures to see firsthand an important project by the emerging NL architects, and his intellectual pleasure shored up, no doubt, through his degrees from both Penn and Harvard as he looked, relooked, and looked again at the spatial complexity of the Kunsthal. All suggest his identity squarely as an architect. Please welcome Roger Sherman.
Now that is a tough introduction to live up to. Thank you, Julia. And it's great to be here at Syracuse. It's been really a pleasure teaching this term and getting to work with you all, not to mention that going on the trip to the Netherlands as well. Hopefully this should help fill in a few of those gaps which have occasionally come up in our discussions regarding the context within which a lot of the approaches that we've been dealing with in my studio have emerged, and this will provide somewhat of an overview for where some of those the comments and directions are coming from. So what I'd like to do today, I have quite a few slides that I'm going to move fairly quickly through. What I've effectively done is really used as an outline a number of the case studies that will appear in the book, the Under the Influence book that Julia mentioned, that will be published next spring by the University of Minnesota, Under the Influence, Negotiating the Complex Logic of Urban Property. And I'm going to kind of proceed each little grouping of work, I think they're in 3 or 4 groups, with the set of ideas that were raised within the context of that book, and for better or for worse, attempt to explicate my own projects in terms of some of the particular lessons that they parallel with respect to those case studies. That's always hazardous terrain, because we've all been to lectures where what precedes is not necessarily what applies to what follows, but I feel as though if I'm to make good on my claims of research and the relationship between research and practice, then I have to practice what I preach. So I'd like to just give a very just general preamble about, with respect to 5 or 6 points that are very important in my own approach to practice and research that really apply to all of these particular the sort of subtopics or kind of lessons. The lecture has a little bit of a quality of being of a sort of primer for contemporary practice, because I really do view what I'm doing in my work as being a sort of new mode of practice for architects, and I think that my students know what I mean by that, and by looking at the importance of trying to recover the importance of the architect's role today, as I say, at the table, that reinstills our value to others outside of our own discourse, to re-instrumentalize our what it is that we do, because indeed the world has changed, and so has the nature of how people understand what we do. So the first of these lessons that I think is very important, that I think distinguishes the way that I tend to approach things from the way that a number of the sort of legacy of modernism, which I think still pervades that of many architects practicing today, is that I'm less interested in my work and my research in envisioning how things should work, but instead am interested in looking at how things already work, the processes by which they happen, and then developing an architecture and planning strategies which harness those in order to look at how else they could work through the redirection of those same behaviors and mechanisms. And that, in short, it's that device of taking contemporary behaviors and looking at how they can be redirected, by which architecture itself, that is the approach to the work formally, becomes itself made more novel through solving these kind of unprecedented problems. The second is that this is really a means of repositioning architectural practice by re-engaging it to the political. The legacy of modernism was such that that the political aspect of architecture, of the architect, was always connected with ideology. That is to say that the architect was considered to be a political figure because he or she had some opinion about politics, and that their work was supposed to embody that. And I think at this point in time, I think I have no illusions about the fact that what architects actually think and their own political views are somewhat irrelevant to the kind of current stream of thought that exists within the world, with or without them. But that it nonetheless still leaves open the opportunity for the architect to occupy a political position, but one which, instead of being through ideology, is actually one through new forms of agency. that is looking at how things happen. And actually, it's a little bit like saying you're not the horse, you're the rider of the horse. And the horse has certain behaviors, and you need to engage those in some form or other, but you also need to, I oftentimes like to say you don't do it by fighting a heroic but ultimately tragic battle by swimming upstream. You do it by actually going downstream, but actually redirecting the stream in ways that are productive, in ways that can be beyond architecturally, just socially or collectively. What I specifically mean about that is that there are such problems such as new forms of collectivity, of new forms of public life, or of urbanism that make more transparent or expressive how we actually live today, that present enormous opportunities for novelty in architecture by simply trying to expose those discrepancies between how the world looks and how it actually happens. That when you actually see, sort of like the movie The Matrix, you're actually able to see what's actually going on. It turns out to be a lot more chaotic, paradoxical, and ultimately interesting and fascinating than the world that architects would wish to control and orchestrate according to their own particular vision, but ultimately oftentimes leads us to irrelevancy, or worse, obsolescence. So in order to do this, it demands to some extent that we think and plan more infrastructurally, so as to accommodate our uncertain times, and even learn how not merely to accept that uncertainty blithely or passively, but importantly to leverage or tilt certain scenarios toward to turn or tilt the way that things happen toward desired ends, and help shape the future without necessarily dictating it. That's indeed a fine line to cross. And finally, hopefully what results from that is a kind of way of establishing ties that bind, unlikely ties that bind, through the identification of new economies and new ecologies that bring people together in surprising, unlikely, and unexpected ways. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what I mean about those things in the examples that follow. So the first case study that I'd like to show you, which is kind of serving as a kind of visual rubric for the first topic, which I call new economies of planning and development, is this site. All the sites in Under the Influence but one are well, actually all the ones you're going to see today are all located in Los Angeles. This is on La Cienega, just in the sort of west side area of Los Angeles. This is a single property that was developed over a period of time. There is an apartment building back here. There's a billboard, which obviously stands in the property, and this palm reader, which stands out front. And obviously, they're not to waste any space. They're also using what little remaining property is left as a kind of parking area for their car. I became fascinated with how these kind of anomalous sites, which really, for the most part, are what tie the sites together, the case studies together that you'll see today. How these things got to be that way. It was really all started on the basis of a hunch that I felt that the urbanism that these things embodied somehow had a degree of vibrancy to them that other projects, including those designed by a lot of architects, seemed somehow to have lacked. And so I wanted to understand exactly how it is that they became this way, and whether or not there might be any lessons that could be learned by delving into them somewhat. So I did some research, and I discovered that over a period of time from 1920 up to 1968, the project actually developed. Here it is, right here. This is the site that you see dotted in. And over a period of time, the apartments were built first in 1939. The store, or the palm reader, came second. It was built out in front in 1962, and in 1968 the billboard was added. Nothing unusual about that, except for the fact that what starts becoming interesting is that as land value increased over this period of time, the imperative to squeeze more juice out of the lemon became sufficient, that there was a kind of heightened imperative to make ever more efficient use of the site and ever more dense use of the site. So the owner kept going back to the well, as it were, to get more money back out of it. Another way of understanding this, using some diagrams which I developed from the application of diagrams of game theory, were that this site, which at this point was empty, once the apartment building went on it, was now worth, not only had the value of the building, but also made the site worth a certain amount more money than when the site was empty. And with the addition of each entity, the dollar sign in effect grows in size. With the addition of each, and the site and the rights to the site are also accordingly subdivided. And in American property, I don't have enough time to get into it, but American property law, in fact, is written in such a way to, in fact, encourage people to divide up the rights to a property so that they can more or less squeeze the property dry of as much income and use value as possible. So it's much more of a, for those of you who have any kind of history background, it's a kind of more Lockean than Jeffersonian view of the landscape, where the landscape's value is seen not scenographically, but it's seen in terms of its labor, the value derived from labor and utility. And that's basically a means of explaining why the city looks like it does. And now that you see this, you start to see more and more of these diagrams, you'll begin to start to see the city pretty exclusively in these terms. Well, it's interesting, it occurred to me that about 5 years before I had found that example, that on a project of my own, which was my own contribution to the RE American Dream book, I had begun to look at this very process in the context of developing proposals for affordable housing in LA. And the premise was very much similar, which was that I noticed that in 1850 in Los Angeles, the typical size of a property was this large, and as time went on and the properties land became increasingly subdivided, the size of the house stayed very much the same, but the land that went with each house became smaller and smaller. This is another way of understanding this process, which is a more conventional way of seeing it, which is that some rich person owned a rancho, which he then sold to 45 other people, who then owned these and then subdivided each of their pieces into another 20 people, and so on and so forth. So what I was interested in here was seeing whether or not I could develop what Bob Summel calls an escape velocity, by which to send forward a projection into a future based upon an iteration forward out of that same process. Whereby I said, well, could you subdivide this property even in one more time as the last perhaps increment of that series of subdivisions, so that in effect, instead of having large developers developing large tracts of land which are no longer available anymore, the individual homeowner could be their own developer. And the project, in effect, really began to evolve out of that. It became necessary to say, well, how do you get two properties, single-family homes, out of one property? And it became clear that that the genesis of novelty in the siting, in the planning strategy, was that the house basically had to explode to the periphery of the site, and that would enable one to make more efficient use of the land, such that each house, putting two for one, so to speak, could have the same amount of usable outdoor space as it currently does, very inefficiently, and at the same time afford to be able to sell off the remaining portion of their land. And so the project basically went from a paradigm of the single-family house that we know so well to one that in effect is more of a perimeter block strategy in a more radical way. But it mixed into this were other kind of behaviors that I had observed in Los Angeles, such as people's tendency to use walls and landscaping as means of demarcating the divisions between their properties, even though they had single-family detached homes. And so we set in a series of party walls, and then those party walls in effect became a means of instigating or proposing a kind of alphabet city of difference of housing typologies, whereby instead of having a Dutch colonial versus a Norman, you would actually have a kind of alphabetization of housing types that actually were a more private means of customization. So iterated over an entire block of the city, which had looked like this at that time, 15 years ago, that would generate something like this. And that a single block might look like this. And then the ground, what we call a ground, where you actually start looking at the ways in which people actually subdivide the material design of their actual landscape, might in fact look like that. This is a model shot. These are some test models that we made at 1/4 inch scale to see whether or not some of these very small spaces that are very urban would actually in fact work. More recently, about 2 years ago, we did something very similar. We revisited the issue by developing a typology for a new ordinance that was recently passed by the City of Los Angeles called the Townhouse Ordinance, which enables a single lot in Los Angeles, no surprise, to actually be subdivided now into any number of up to oftentimes 6 or 8 different sublots. What we looked at was the idea that instead of a developer coming in and simply subdividing all 8 of them and selling them off, whether there could be more of a self-organized means of doing that. Like with the RE American Dream project, we called this the grow home, because the idea was that frequently, because the land is the predominant expense for most people who live in Los Angeles and the house is relatively cheap, that most people are pretty much maxed out by the time they buy the land and can't afford to build more as much house as they'd like to. And so what ends up happening is that after they start having a family, they're left to go move to another neighborhood instead of staying where they are. So we thought to ourselves, well, why would it not be more sustainable somehow if there was actually somebody figured out a strategy by which they could actually stay there and actually build into their own property the capacity to grow, hence the grow home, within their own property as they had more capital available, and therefore stay in the neighborhood and stabilize the neighborhood. So in effect what we did here was come up with a series of, we came up with a basic strategy of subdivision, suggested that basically once that was done, people would build a kind of minimum, existence minimum home that might be okay for them as a single person or as a couple, and that as their family expanded or their needs expanded, like they added an office or something, there'd be a variety of different types of growth strategies that they could pursue. They could fill in the porch that they had into an extra room. They could add an addition on the side. And all of those kind of options were figured out, and there was no more NIMBYism because of the fact that everybody sort of understood the operating terms, the operating procedures, and there was a little bit more certainty with respect to how what one neighbor was doing would impact that of their neighbor at the same time. A landscape project for Fresh Kills landfill, which we lost to field operations, dealt with this in a different kind of way and in a different scale. This is way too complex a project to get into right now, but I want to just kind of go over the salient features. This is Staten Island and this is Fresh Kills, 2,200 acres. That's almost 3 times the size of Central Park. These are the other parks that are located, like Central Park in Manhattan, but we've also shown where the ferry runs down to where we're proposing that access points using the old barges would take you to Fresh Kills. This is the site. I'm going to run through this very quickly. We divided the site into 7 different, what we called ecologies, that were based upon a kind of reading of the characteristics that the site already possessed, as well as those which were built into it through the landfill that famously exists there, the world's largest landfill. Most of you may know that the remains from the World Trade Center are located there as well. So the site was already differentiated into these 7 territories, some of which existed and others of which were kind of projections, such as this, which we called the commercial berm, which was along right across from a major regional shopping center. But what I'd like to talk about a little bit was about the fact that as a practical matter, we understood that there are no more building Central Parks. Nobody can afford, unless they have the benefit of having very wealthy landowners living around them, around the park. No park can afford, unlike Central Park, which does have that luxury of being able to be as highly maintained as Central Park is, so that no matter when you go, the park looks the same, unless Christo happens to have worked for 20 years to put something in. So we said, well, it actually is that if you could actually limit the amount of expense in a very strategic way that goes toward maintaining things or making things special, meaning maintenance programs, then in effect those 7 ecologies I talked about earlier are in effect set in place and allowed to be let go after everything is initially put in place. And then there is a countervailing strategy of these things we call transects, which is actually derived from a landscape term, which is like a test bed for trying out new experiments, new plant species, seeing what kind of creatures will come to your park and so on. It's a temporal strategy. We looked at a way of, in effect, using these transects, which tend to be very long, kind of long cuts through the landscape, which tend to be very geometrical, having a geometrical language, to in effect urbanize the park in a new way that was both reminiscent of the way Central Park is cut by infrastructure, but at the same time is done through maintenance, landscape maintenance practices, and is also simultaneously used as a means of navigating the park as a wayfinding system. So we imagined that the park could be curated and scheduled very much like a museum, whereby there'd be a sculpture garden, or an exercise circuit, or a wet zone, or extreme golf that would be scheduled much like a museum would schedule an exhibition, and it would be open from one date to another date, maybe 1 week during the year or maybe over a 2-year period. And it would be a reason, moreover, that to actually motivate people to come to see the park as they would come to see a museum, because there actually would be something special that they would be able to see there that they wouldn't have seen the last time that they were there. And this would require a new administrative structure for the park to actually administer this as well. But moreover, it would be a means of finding sources of funding for the installation of some of these exhibits, some of these programs. So over time, this is an imagined timeline, the shape of these transects, these routes would change so that you'd need a new map every time you came and there was a change, or a new route would open up and you could see a different part of the park than you were able to see before. Then there was an issue of materials and how those things would be made, and what we imagined was that these transects would actually be made out of the stuff that the transects cross through, so that when they actually cross through one kind of landscape material, say a meadow, it would actually be made by mowing the meadow, and then the mown clippings would actually be bundled up, and you could actually use those hay bales, let's say, to actually define architecturally what those things could be. In effect, recycling a lot of the same materials that were grown at the site, but repackaging them in ways that might not have been able to be imagined. So there was a kind of other form of programmatic ecology which was enabled through maintenance, just as other pieces were left alone. This is a model that was made in resin and a variety of different materials, showing through the resin you can see the garbage. Literally, this is where the landfill mounds are, and these holes that are drilled through are where the methane vents are located that actually release the methane gases that are being built up in the mounds, which are like natural bioreactors. There's much more to talk about this, but I kind of have to go on. This is a transect, which is nothing but a picnic table, which we call the 5K picnic table, which basically is extraordinary, which we like very much, because it takes something that's utterly mundane, and simply by making it extreme, and we do live in an extreme culture, one that's tied to identity, makes the idea of having a picnic be something that suddenly becomes exceptional through its exaggeration. This is the extreme golf course that you can see here. This is the commercial berm. This is one of the freshwater wetlands. The remains of the World Trade Center are up here, and then there are a variety of other things, like a flower show, a transect of a flower show that weaves through over here. But there are a lot of interesting transects that already were found on the site, such as this expressway that cuts through it, and actually, oddly enough, some dredging that was done by Frederick Law Olmsted, who seemed to have gotten everywhere, through this wetland as well. So again, we were using past events to actually pose possible futures, not in a visionary way, but in a way that, again, we're trying to achieve escape velocity, that we're trying to cast forward out of what had already happened, but in a new kind of way. The next case study is again representing means of raising the issue of what I call producing new monumentality and landmarks, or new definitions of context. This is what we call the Flower Tower, for many years, people have commuted up and down east and west on Olympic Boulevard through Beverly Hills, passing this and never really quite knowing what it is. Which is extraordinary because everybody knows it, but nobody knows what it is. So we asked the same question, what is that thing? And so as with everything else, there was an amazing story that, as I've argued to my students, is far more interesting than anything you could make up. This is actually an oil derrick belonging to Veneco Oil, which was built at the roughly the same time as this, which is Beverly Hills High School. The oil derrick sits on the property of Beverly Hills High School, and 17% of the annual revenue of Beverly Hills High School is supplied by the royalties from this oil well. So toxicity be damned. So here are the kids taking track practice, and here's the oil derrick. This is Century City, which we'll figure in just a second. About 5 years ago, somebody got the good idea that a nonprofit artist project, which is called Project something like 1026 or 7304.
9865.
Is it 9865? No, that's 9865. That's actually the address of the street address of the project. It was an artist who, together with a nonprofit, came to the oil company and said, "Look, you and I know that everybody hates your being here. You're a necessary evil. The people everybody considers you to be an eyesore. Why don't you let us take the disguising of the oil derrick, which turned out to be acoustical padding, and take that off and distribute this around cancer wards throughout California, and we'll have kids paint these flowers on them, and we'll decorate it." So what's actually happened when you actually trace the project was you go from seeing that there was the oil derrick, which we call naked. It didn't bother anybody at that time because there was no Century City, and Beverly Hills was too happy with the money they were getting to complain about it. What happened was that when Century City came here, suddenly they were annoyed. There was a reverse NIMBYism. They came last, but they were unhappy because this was creating a lot of noise. So the derrick got covered by acoustical padding in response to the complaints of office workers. And then they put the acoustical padding on, and it was abated. And then we end up with something we call the monument, which somebody recognized was a kind of monument in the making. It was something that somebody saw as a business opportunity that simultaneously would solve a problem in dealing with political problems in the neighborhood. And so Portraits of Hope, which is the name of the project, I'm now reminded, basically negotiated the deal. And now when you drive down there, what do you see? Okay, well, this is a game theory diagram that shows what's actually happened over a period of time as these different interests have compounded over time. So that's Veneco Oil is the derrick, money is obviously the dollar sign, noise pollution is the ear, visual enhancement is it comes at the end, and the population that gets added causes the ear thing. I'll get to the kind of punchline of this in a minute, but this seen versus unseen, these are the tentacles of the oil rig, which run sometimes as much as 2 miles underground to places that are very far away from where the derrick is. And all of these people receive royalty checks every month. They are now all over the world, and they get a royalty check. So this is what I call a web of property. The web of property is now one which in a global world is not just of the people who literally live under there, but who in many cases have sold their homes but held on to the oil rights, to the mineral rights for the check, many of whom are elderly at this point. This is the web that explains how all of those parties connect. And this is the beauty of it for me, which is what's called a coupling diagram, a web of property. So when you see this is what we see, is the obelisk. But when the people involved with children's cancer see it, they see it as a monument to children's cancer. When people who live in Beverly Hills see it, they see it as an entry to Beverly Hills because it turns out that it's right at the line of Beverly Hills as you move in from Century City. And finally, if you're Bill Anger, whose office is actually in this building, one of those, that triangular building across from this, and have an axial Versailles-like view, you see it as being your company's moniker. That's what I call the coupling diagram. Basically means that you get these valences of what monuments used to be and when there was a collectivity, and now in effect we have a more fragmented society, but there's a new form of collectivity that emerges. So this is the view out his window from his office. This is the Beverly Hills sign. This is literally the line to Beverly Hills. Okay, so now we're moving to a project in Toledo, that another competition we lost to a certain introducer. This is a project for Toledo, Ohio, that in many ways tries to work somewhat with this issue of different audiences, but more importantly to really look for new forms of collectivity or new forms of landmarking. This is a site that sits right at a kind of entry point into downtown Toledo, Ohio. This is a big expressway that is a one-way expressway leading right through. That's one way, and as we understand it, there are 40,000 people every morning on weekday mornings that pass right through this intersection. So it's not exactly the kind of place that's going to be made pedestrian friendly. So how do you deal with that? It didn't really seem to have an audience because this was an area that had yet to be redeveloped, but it was intended to herald the reawakening of this area, the rebirth and the renaissance of an area that is still looking for people to move there. They were looking at it, in our estimation, since it was being funded by an arts organization, and it worked under a kind of premise that I think is somewhat faulty in my experience, which is the idea that an art piece could actually represent or could actually be an instigation for urban revitalization. And so we tried to kind of, but it was a really interesting problem, and we were very glad that we worked on this because it was a means of sort of trying to walk this very fine line between the importance of understanding the instrumentality of imageability to what was needed, but at the same time to make the thing actually work within the everyday life of the city at the same time. So what we looked at was the fact that this city used to, this area was a warehouse district, and that very same road that led in, let's see if I can get to it, that this very same road that led in to the site used to be part of the Erie Canal system right into the city, and that different materials were basically being taken right on that very route that would then be stored in these buildings before it went out into Lake Erie. And so we wondered whether or not there was a way of reading the context in which, instead of taking a sentimental approach to that kind of history and that character, we could find some new way of actually giving that kind of usefulness to the site that would embed it with a kind of publicness. This is the intersection that we're talking about. Pretty tough. So what we ended up doing was starting to work a little bit more interdisciplinarily by looking at ways that we could thread the 5 or 6 lanes of traffic that ran through here, so that 3 of the lanes were through lanes of traffic that ran into downtown, but there were certain dedicated lanes that were ultimately already, and some of which were already in place as turning lanes to other direction, to going other directions in the city, that could actually be part of the orchestration of a recycling center and a public, what's called a corporate yard for the city, which is where cities keep building materials. And in this case, it turned out, upon doing research into the city, that in fact the city of Toledo not only had a recycling program, but it also had a mulching program. It also had salt. It also had a salt storage for winter, and it even had greenhouses by which they grow flowers for the streetscape system, the streetscape planting program, landscaping program in the spring and summer. So we looked at this as a kind of new form of exchange area, a place of exchange within the city that during limited hours would allow some of the lanes of traffic, some of these exchange stations or lanes would be dedicated to being open during certain hours where drop-offs of recycling or pickups of other goods being sold by the city could actually be gained en route to some other destination. So rather than this really being a destination in itself, it was intended to sort of catch people on the way from one place to another. Moreover, what we did was we interpreted the context in material terms. We were looking for what we called material economies and material ecologies. We translated the context not in terms of making things that looked like other buildings, but rather by using materials that were produced in Toledo itself that Toledoans would recognize. And we put those as a form of sample boards in these new kinds of landscapes that would turn on and turn off in response to stimuli during different seasonal conditions and lighting conditions. This is a section through showing this is where the materials would be laid in. This is all fill, and then the vending station was on the other side. And this is a very complex diagram which shows some of the materials that we worked with. So we use, for instance, Kerber's beer bottles as one of the material samples. This is a beer that's locally produced. These bottles are unique, almost collector's items. These are bird feeders to attract what's called the mud hen, which is that's their semi-pro baseball team, and it's kind of, we laugh, but it's very important to Toledoans. The tires are produced in the nearby Jeep factory, as well as windshields by Pilkington Glass. So all of the materials that are all taken from Toledo, or in the case of the bird feeders, they're not made in Toledo, but they attract an audience, in this case birds, which somehow are a recognizable audience in Toledo. So, so this just is a means of kind of referring back to that web diagram that suggests that it's through the economy and ecology of materials that a kind of idea of a monument is made, or a public space that makes reference through materials to the different audiences, as it were. Pilkington, this is the old canals, canal route, and the Jeep factory. The salt mounds, the mulching program, the flower growing program through the Department of Parks and Rec, and the recycling. Mirali Euclides is an artist who your dean, Mark Robbins, readily recognized at the time as somebody who works through this means of the strong associations which both practices and materials have through her art world, but oftentimes not architects make decisions more on the basis of what things look like and not necessarily how they may be embedded with particular associations. So here you can see how under certain conditions the NaCl of the salt burns through the snow when it snows, or in the springtime these sacs which have been embedded with seeds start growing flowers, or the reflectors at night turn on in response to headlights. When it rains, the Pilkington Glass windshields become a fountain, and so on and so forth. In other words, they only explain themselves in a sort of interactive way in response to different conditions. So like Fresh Kills, the project really never quite looks the same anytime you go by it, because it depends when you happen to be passing by. And the idea was ultimately that if you're going by something 5 days a week, and you're doing it, 340 days a year, it starts to become something that doesn't pass your threshold of noticeability very easily. I'm going to actually just deal with this very quickly, but the idea, we actually ran pro formas that showed how the programs came with a certain revenue in terms of mulch sales that would enable us to leverage the construction of the project, which was going to cost more than the budget that was allocated, so that we could start with one mound or two that would help pay for the third one, and the third for the fourth, and so on. So it was a strategy of leveraging that in the same way kind of builds over time. Next one, second of the four, is what I call new forms of collectivity, the new politics and economics of collectivity. This is a car wash in Los Angeles and Hollywood. maybe not as spectacular, but the car wash is, as those of you who have been to LA or have the experience of going to them elsewhere is the kind of animal that comes with its own food chain. It tends to be where you find a car wash, you tend to find a juice bar, you tend to find a locksmith oftentimes, and a number of other micro businesses which otherwise could not survive in the ecosystem of the city, but take advantage of that very, very precise 15 minutes that you're waiting for your car in Los Angeles, and you actually are out of your car and available for business, so to speak. So in this case, it was a really exceptional situation where there was a great, just a marvelous kind of intricacy of relationships that were established, that were expressed architecturally. For instance, between the juice bar. The juice bar shared the same architecture as the car wash. It had the same turquoise and orange mansard roof. The flows were intermingled with one another, the pedestrian flows to the juice bar. They even used, as you'll see in a second, they even used the same washing machines. I hesitate to tell you where this is located after admitting that. They put the rags for the cars into the same thing that they were actually using to wash the dishes and stuff from the juice bar. But at any rate, there's an adjacent apartment building that had negotiated an arrangement with the car wash for the car wash to place its menu of services on, and in turn also became a kind of place from which the residents of the apartment building could sit and watch, which in LA is quite a spectacle of all the hand washing going on. I'm not talking about just the political hand washing. And then finally, the most interesting one, which I'll talk about in a second, is this funny leftover space, which I showed in the first photo, which looks like it's actually part of the public right-of-way. This is the adjacent apartment building with the area where people hang out and watch on weekends. This is the juice bar, which is also a place where a lot of people hang out and wait for their car. And this area, which is that funny area, actually is not part of the public right-of-way, but is very, very, I think, very clever and savvy means at no real expense of the car wash giving over in an act of kind of apparent goodwill a more or less useless portion of their property to something that is able to then advertise their business as, in effect, environmentally clean, and also kind of a good public servant, good public face. A very simple gesture, maybe unspectacular and pretty subtle, but I think pretty interesting as a kind of gimme or a kind of trade-in. Seeming like a big transition, but you'll see that it's not. This is a house for myself, my family, which we built about 4 years ago in Santa Monica. You'll see the connection in a second. The house is located right here on a hillside. The house is located in a zone, in an R2 zone, which was important to us because it meant that we could build 2 units on the property that would give us the ability to rent the second unit in order to help us pay the mortgage. So that was important because these are just some of the setback diagrams, but it was important because of the fact that what it ended up forcing was a kind of a little bit of a Monopoly game, or maybe a 3D chess game, where we needed to figure out how to kind of to live on this property in the presence of somebody else who wasn't part of our family, but yet because it was a very small site, both gave us privacy and at the same time provided a degree of sociability that could serve, we believe pretty sincerely, as a new prototype for how to urbanize the suburban texture of Los Angeles. So it was a kind of revisitation in an odd way of our American Dream stuff. So these 3 colors that you see here show that what we're trying to do with the kind of ochre color, the burnt umber rather, is the house. It interlocks with the yellow color of the rental unit, and then also a home office, an office for myself at that time, in purple that also sits in there. They're very kind of intricately interwoven. The entry actually comes between one portion of the rental unit and the office of the house, and kind of like a pea shooter splits the difference and comes into the house in the back, which takes possession of the backyard, while the office looks out front along with the one portion of the apartment unit. And then there are a variety of different devices, such as this flipper door, which divert visitors to my office right into the office without being allowed back through the house. So what we were really looking to do was, in effect, try to make something positive out of the friction and the problems that were created by having to cram three things that ordinarily in Los Angeles one had a luxury of being able to have separate and in dispersed locations all into one place, which is why it's called the 3-in-1 house. So there are a variety of different inventions that were required in order to mediate between the problems that would exist. Here, you're looking as you come in the house down to the kitchen, but this is the conference room, which is a kind of swing space between the office and the main part of the house. So the office is right here. The house has been kind of pulled away, and this is that space that I'm referring to of the conference area, which is also a dining room at other hours. Here's the flipper door that I was talking about, and then what you'll also see is that there's a shelf, which you saw in the photo, which is dishes and a buffet for the kitchen and dining area, but travels along and into the office, becoming a model shelf as it moves on through the office. And so its functions change as it moves through the house, like a form of infrastructure. Here you can see it a little bit more easily. We oddly looked at higher forms of density, like a New York tenement, and in effect understood that in a certain kind of way you could view the house as having been the devolution of the tenement, which was based upon a multifamily unit plan that in effect became suburbanized by breaking away and adapting to more of a detached context. So we looked at some different ways by which that thing began to acclimate itself to a kind of easier environment. And then the rental unit, which is entered right here as opposed to the front door of the house, which is here, and the door into the office, a separate opening to the office on warmer days, which is here. Actually, this window right here opens down into the main living area of the rental unit, but a stair immediately goes up and over the door to the house, but the office as well into the bedroom of the rental unit. So they're all kind of rather intricately interlocked. A similar kind of look at strange forms of collectivity, unlikely forms of collectivity, had to do with a peculiar problem we had in designing kind of custom home for a client that we didn't know who it was going to be. It was a spec home. And I liked the idea that it was actually a spec home. I sort of said, well, instead of just considering that license to do whatever I wanted to, I wonder whether it could be a basis for deciding about speculation on who might live in the home. But instead of just going with one scenario, this is located in Gloucestershire in England. You can find more information about it on a website it's called Lower Mill Estate. And it's an old gravel quarry that's all about 6 or 7 feet deep. And there's a kind of upper middle class development of homes, but then there are these special custom homes by people like Sarah Featherstone and Will Alsop, who've also done a couple of designs for it. Looks pretty standard as those things go. We, on the other hand, wanted to say, well, we don't know who's going to live here, so the best we can do is try to figure out who the different types of people are who might live here. So we started to look. We looked at the pontoon technology because we knew that it was going to be on this lake, and we tried to figure out whether or not there could be some way of using the pontoons in such a way that they became like forms of partition, which enabled the house to be used by one person, one large family, or divide the house up depending upon whatever contingency might arise with respect to who it was sold to. So we looked at it very much like a valve in a trumpet, where when the pontoons were pushed in, you'll see how this all works in a second. Basically, the house was reasonably continuous and allowed for a fairly easy flow in and out of across the house, sort of this way. And this would also have a tendency to be in response to winter climes versus the summer climes. But in the summer or warmer temperatures, that when the valve was actually opened, these actually oddly constricted continuity across here because it constricted it to just being in very specific places where you would have controlled access. And these kind of valves that would open up were actually a portion of the bedrooms that ordinarily were bigger, that would go out as a form of bivouacking in a way, with mosquito screens and a closet with them that you could then come the bathrooms would stay here in the kind of boathouse, and the bedrooms became a kind of existence minimum. It was like a form of camping out on the water when you wish to do that. But also by being displaced, they opened up a series of interior recreational spaces, such as here we're showing, for example, bocce, a jacuzzi, and a kind of eco pool, which is really just a piece of the water of the pond that is kind of closed off by a filter or netting. And then what we in effect did was look at how, depending upon which of the valves you opened at one particular time, could allow for different circulation paths, a variety of different circulation paths, and a variety of different types of collectives, of different groupings of people, a single person and a couple, et cetera, et cetera. This is showing, well, you can see that it reads across that there are varieties, but what we were seeking to do was find a way that, kind of unlike the Pompidou model of flexibility in response to uncertainty, that this kind of contingency planning or contingent planning did not result in the dumbing down of architecture, but actually in a higher degree of specificity that made the project more piquant or more particular. So here you can see it in the summertime when all the pieces are closed. It has a deck up top, and then the deck is lifted up to create these chaise lounges that then allow light underneath them down into the bathrooms. And this is a kind of parasol that opens up either in rain or in very, very warm weather up on top as well. This is when the pieces are actually pulled out onto the pond. Okay. How am I doing on time? I'm at the last bit of things. The last one I'd like to talk about is new audiences and new spaces. This was the last of the case studies that I found for the book. This is called Strawberry Field, and it's a regulation wiffle ball field that's in Encino, in the San Fernando Valley, believe it or not. So it can happen to you, and it actually is sitting off of a cul-de-sac in a very actually well-to-do part of Encino. And the fellow who lives in this house, his name is Rick Messina. He's a very successful agent. He represents Tim Allen and Drew Carey and a host of other comedians, and he's very good friends with them, and they're all inveterate bachelors. So this fellow is, as you'll find out, is kind of quite a character, and he bought this house, and he started getting really frustrated with the fact that, as many of you who may have grown up on cul-de-sacs know, he had this pie-shaped lot, but he had this square house, and he had all this land that was being wasted on the two sides. And he kept thinking, this is ridiculous, I'm wasting all this, and he liked playing wiffle ball, and he noticed that his driveway, which was on this side of the house, was almost good enough for wiffle ball, but he kept hitting the wiffle ball into the next guy's yard because it was too narrow of a pie shape. So being an agent and a deal maker, he went over to his neighbor and he said, you know, you're just wasting your side yard next to me, because the other guy's driveway was on the other side of his thing. He said, I'll tell you what, if you let me have your side yard, you can have equal rights to using this regulation size wiffle ball field that I'm going to make. And the guy went for it. So what happened was, here's the original thing with the driveway that comes in, where you would turn around, and the garage was located here. And then what happened was, again, like with many other things, one thing begat another thing, and things started to build on one another. He basically made the deal with his neighbor, so he got to expand into this far. But then they started realizing, when he was working with this contractor, that the outfield wall was still too short, because people were hitting it up into the field. And so what he did was he found out who owned this property behind him. He knew it was the Department of Water and Power. not exactly your neighbor, but they owned a huge reservoir, which is up a hill. And there's a big hillside that comes down toward his field. So we went to them and he said, can I build a retaining wall right here? And they said, well, all we really care about is that we have access up to our property. So if you build a retaining wall here, you need to put a handicap ramp up there. So in case we have a disabled service worker, you've got that there. And then while he was building that, his cousin, who was actually dismantling the Meadowlands Stadium at the very same time in New Jersey, said, "Oh, you're building this, this field. Well, I've got all these seats for free that I'm taking out of the Meadowlands. Would you take those?" And he said, "Oh, that's perfect." So he started building this kind of vision of what he could do. He started making deals with liquor companies who, if he advertised on the wall, would supply him with discounted liquor for a bar that he had set up just outside of the dugout, which is actually right here. He had a water fountain and all the other accoutrements that you would actually find in a ball field. This is the batter's box, the pitcher's mound, and these are the grandstands. The speakers are in rocks that exist right up on the hillside back here. Here are the signs. Here's the neighbor's house. The kind of pièce de la résistance was the fact that he came finally to his neighbor and he said, "Listen, I really want to build a broadcast booth. So would you let me do that? You can use it to hang out there and play." And so the guy said, "Yeah, that'd be great." So every Sunday afternoon, all of his clients come over, all the bachelors, and they cook dinner, they smoke pot, and they actually do impersonations and stand up, calling the game from the broadcast booth up top. And the neighbors all love it, of course, because it's this grand form of entertainment. This is the dugout here with the requisite water fountain. He's got closed-circuit television all throughout the house, so you can watch the other games on TV if this one's boring. This is the view from the broadcast booth, which is really kind of what I use as kind of the Louis XIV's bathroom view of his estate. This is really the kind of the muse of the negotiator and what's possible in the kind of what the new collectivity might look like. So this is again a series of steps of these bilateral exchanges that he engaged in order to arrive at this. What the important thing is that he did not go in with a prescribed plan. He had a kind of loose idea of what he wanted, and as opportunities presented themselves, he found ways to be opportunistic and to build those into the project and to let the project sort of steer around it and kind of emerge. This project, which I'm going to just show very briefly in the spirit of this idea of new collectivities, is really tied to the notion of the enclave, which Rayner Banham talked about in the 60s. He said that that urbanism was Los Angeles. Los Angeles was the face of urbanism today, and it was the enclave, or what he called enclavization. We wanted to look at that and look at 100 years hence and see where that would take us, because it seemed that it was, to all three of us, Dana, Bob, and I, that it was more true today than it was ever true even in Banham's time, that he was really prophetic about it. So we said that what's going on right now is that Los Angeles right now, in 1906, Los Angeles was only this big. But it had a few enclaves, just a few, such as Chinatown, but for the most part, everybody was an Angelino. That means if you lived in Los Angeles, you didn't live in an enclave. Your experience of LA was like everybody else's experience, and they actually maybe went to City Hall and had collective events and so on. But as Los Angeles has continuously expanded, there was a series of phasing diagrams that led to this. Today, this is a map of what Los Angeles looks like in some loose form, which is that it's literally riddled with what we call holes, which is that the socially connective fabric of Los Angeles, of what most people consider to be what Banham called the plains of id, which was the continuous fabric of everyday Los Angeles, has been riddled with holes which are defined as enclaves. special places that either have been built anew, such as the Grove, or City Walk, or Hancock, certain parts of Hancock Park, or ones which existed as part of the black and were converted to white by people who gated them, like St. Louis. They were actually retro-holed, so to speak. And another way of explaining this is that from 1900, as I said, there were only really three holes. There was Chinatown, West Adams, and Angelino Heights. And as time has gone on, this is when Banham was talking about it, there now, by the year 2000, are a sampling of at least, well, these are probably 30 or 40 holes, but there are easily twice as many of these. And our theory was that by the time 2100 rolls around, the whole city will be nothing but holes. Well, you could be fairly pessimistic about that and say this is really, really bad. Is there anything we can do about it? But what we were trying to say was resisting it is not really the answer. This is happening. The better thing to do is to try to understand what drives these things and to figure out how to open the enclave. In other words, accept the fact that it's here to stay, that people are really strongly tied to notions of identity, like the idea that golfers like to retire and live on golf courses, but to try to figure out the way not to make them exclusive, so that, in fact, the mobility afforded by Los Angeles, by the car in Los Angeles, is one that people enjoy being able to assume the identity of going someplace else that's different than where they live, and be that person or try that out for a day or for a few hours. We all tend to do that in Los Angeles, where we go, we have dinner in one part of the city and then we walk around because we like what that offers. So we proposed these four different zones that we had come up with, and we did a kind of model that showed how these different holes that we came up with could develop a kind of openness to them. The last project that I want to show you is one that we just finished a couple of days ago. That is a kind of first effort to really deliver on this idea of the open enclave, and it puts together in many other ways some of the discussions that I've been having here tonight with regard to material and economies and ecologies as well. This is a project for a mini mall, a strip mall in Scottsdale, Arizona, along Scottsdale Road. It's actually for a competition called Flip-A-Strip. Scottsdale runs north-south right here. This is the 2-acre site that exists there. It's a very characteristic mini mall. Now these mini malls are actually failing, these strip malls in Scottsdale, and they're desperately in need of trying to figure out, even their owners, of some kind of business plan by which they can survive again. So this is a Chinese restaurant, a steakhouse. There are a few other odds and ends here, but some vacancies. What we decided to do was really look at how you not only could build more here, but give this place a kind of identity that was tagged to something that observed another kind of trend that was coming on, that was actually observed from the city, that was happening at a macro scale, and to look at the project as more of a prototype for what could happen if the model that we proposed actually could proliferate across the city as newer paradigms. So we actually are proposing to bring a supplemental program of a hydroponic urban farm to the property. And it turns out that these hydroponic urban farms are enormously profitable. This is occurring in a city, meanwhile, that is gobbling up all the land around it, and in so doing, it's arable land. Hydroponic farming, and I'm not mistaking the numbers when I tell you that 1 acre of hydroponic farming can generate 18,000 heads of lettuce per week, year-round. Which, if the heads of lettuce are sold for $1 a head profit, I mean, in Los Angeles, if it's better lettuce, it's $2 a head. They can earn up to about $900,000 a year in profits for that 1 acre. So we looked at the system by which hydroponic technologies work, and there's actually quite a variety of types that work both in trays and also even on vertical surfaces, now, such as this vertigrow system of algae biodiesel. It's very low tech. We actually made a kind of where I was referring to as the project is called Chia Mesa, because it's we're proposing a new landscape. We're trying to derive. We're extrapolating from the character of the landscape that already characterizes the Southwest, the Mesa, but we're suggesting that rather than eating up that landscape, it's producing new mesas. It's producing more of the kind of character that is already intrinsic to the region, but it's doing it in a way that's now transformed in a newfangled way that's a characteristic of the new, more synthetic landscape. So it's really just a draping strategy of trays of hydroponics that sit as a large green roof and green and vertical green gardens that come down the sides of this property. So the gardens, it's actually pretty worked out, all sit on trays, and all the servicing happens up here. The parking, this is the commercial spaces that have been added on top of the one story of commercial that already exists here. This is the reservoir for the recycled water from the hydroponics, which only consumes 5% of the amount of water of traditional agriculture. This is a kind of a piece of the mesa that actually comes down into a kind of gorge, and these vertical pieces are grown. This is all grown with grow lights at night to increase the growing of all of this. This is a side of the mesa inside where people are in there. They come out of their cars behind here and walk through these holes and out, and the stairs are actually embedded in the mesa wall. So the idea is these mesas will the mesas would start to recharacterize the nature of the city and become the kind of new monuments of the city, just as the old mesas become the landmarks of the landscape that it started with. But more importantly, as the city grows and swallows up all of the land around it to its practical limits, these holes, which are really they're the descendant of the holes from OZLA, start opening up and recovering the productivity of the land that was lost through the sprawl.
How tall are they?
This tip, which is at the far end from this neighborhood, is 75 feet tall, and at the lowest point, which is down here, it's 18 feet tall. There's the gorge, which runs between the parking structure and the commercial building, is aligned here through an easement from this street coming through the back. This is a view looking up the boulevard with the vents. All of these are polycarbonate panels. They're very lightly built. The project would pay itself back in 5 years at this degree of productivity. And we also have this. Of course, you need signage. We created these things called cliff sellings, which are actually where the types of businesses that would find it attractive to be branded in connection with a project like this, such as spas and juice bars and farmers markets and so on and so forth, would find their advertising located in these cliff dwellings that would be embedded in the polycarbonate, and that at night when the grow lights were on, it would create this new imageability of the plants that were scaling up the sides. In which the entire building would be wrapped. That's it. Thanks for bearing with me.
So we have a couple minutes for questions, if you have questions for Roger.
Sorry, it was on us. Happy to. My students, it's time for you to get your just desserts.
I have an initial question.
Yeah.
It has to do with form.
Mm-hmm.
The work all seems to have kind of either anti-formal or unformal desire about it. John, I'm wondering, if you prefer for Westerners to use the microphone? Yes. The question is about form.
Yes.
And an observation that the work as a kind of body of work has either anti-formal or unformal desire. Would that be fair? And how might you talk about form or the formal implications of what it is?
I wouldn't say that it's anti-formal. I hope it's not. I'd say that that there's a point in the process of working on these where the observation of the processes ends up searching for the form for itself to assume. In the case of the mesa, there was nothing specific about the hydroponics that linked to a mesa. It was a kind of marrying together of a kind of new form of instrumentality of, you know, what was it that was going to actually serve as the cohesive tissue socially that would draw people together as in terms of what needed both economically to work and socially, and there is a kind of formal conceit, but it's not accidental. In that case, it was actually very specifically picked for a reason, so that there is clear there. It was intended to be both strange and kind of uncanny, like where did that come from? But it then, I suppose, to be in full disclosure, that it's something that I've always admired about OMA's work, which is that they throw something at you that seems like the most unlikely of things, but then as you unpack it, you realize, no, actually it connects. It's not at all arbitrary. It actually ties into its context in a very particular way. I think that, there may be a higher degree of consciousness about what this thing looks like in terms of imageability, and that's a more recent development in my practice. But I think, for instance, in the case of my house, the reason I'd say it's not anti-formal is that the form ends up resulting from, kind of looking at all the setback laws and how that ends up naturally shaping the house. The shape of the house literally emerges from an interest in indexing the forces that actually exist politically and economically. But as with many architects, when actually pushed, and to be quite honest, ultimately there is also some tweaking that goes on in the end. But I think the idea is that it's important that the thing have a kind of a readability to it, a kind of legibility. The question is really whether or not it has a specific association as this one does, or as in the case of my house, the thing is really more of a kind of response to a set of, for lack of a better term, kind of statistical data. And I think in some ways I'm moving away, a little bit more toward the importance of things having certain kinds of associations as well. I think with the Toledo project, the mounds of Chillicothe and things like that in Ohio, they're lurking under there. So it's kind of like putting a set of things together that don't ordinarily necessarily go together, and then a new imageability emerges. But if you look at each thing, it comes from a traceable source.
I was wondering, a lot of your work seems to operate within kind of these areas of hyperdensity or hyper infrastructure, I would say.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, is that kind of, and places where there are, you're kind of already projecting that there's going to be this hyperdensity if it isn't already there. I was wondering, is that kind of the desired outcome, or is that the inevitable outcome that you see for urbanity in a way?
That's a great question, really good question. Part of that is honestly as a product of working in Los Angeles, where the issue of density is always, it's like being in the water. You can't get to the bottom. The water will keep you afloat. And in the case of Los Angeles, almost any problem you deal with, you're literally and figuratively being pushed at by questions of density and intensity of land use all the time. But I think that in terms of my own, and maybe at this point it's so ingrained that I can't separate the two, so that if I actually went someplace where it had no reason to be dense whatsoever, that I wouldn't still do it anyway. But I do think that the issue of density, as I was talking about in my house, I feel that it charges the problem in a way that creates novelty. Like our house is much more interesting because it was pushed into that. It was forced. Its hand was forced. And if I had just been able to do a case like the case studies, the John and Tenza thing, where I could have just concentrated on steel prefabrication and had a regular inside-outside relationship. So I found that I need that as a means to get off the rock and force something else that hasn't been solved before, as well as intellectually and otherwise. But I think density is, at least for me, it's a kind of predominant, stimulant for things. And I probably credit OMA with that too. I mean, they create density where none is necessary. It's a kind of downtown athletic club thing where you don't, you take New York wherever you go, even if you're not in New York anymore, right? Yeah.
With your urban projects, how important is it for you to pull from the region's history or the iconography, whatever, sorry. Is it a basis for the design for the area, or is it the gimmick that you're trying to instill going off of the region's look or the region's history, or is it a melding of both, kind of trying to put it in the context of the studio?
That's a good question too. I think it varies a little bit. Sometimes it has a more intrinsic part in the programming of the project, and in other cases it plays a more specific role in terms of the imaging of it, where you're looking to, I've used with you guys, I've used the term the Trojan horse, and sometimes what I do is I will use the context of something, by the way, much like many other architects do, to try to sell something by being contextual that may not inherently be that way. But what I try to do is always look for the latent, I look for the buried lead. I look for the story of the history that is not the obvious one, that I can bring forward that creates a kind of unexpected thing. There was a really great lecture that I think, John, you were at UCLA 3 years ago, where what's his name, from FOA, Alejandro Zaropolo, was talking about the Yokohama project, and he really appalled Sylvia Lavin, who I guess is coming here in a couple of weeks, because he said that they sold it to the community as being all about a whale. Is it a whale or a wave? A wave. And it wasn't about a wave at all. But at the same time, he was smart enough to know that, if people could see that in it, then that was that was something not to be sneezed at. I mean, that he came open with that, I thought was actually a good thing, that built complexity into it for me, that, rather than just arguing it on purely academic terms. I think to the extent that thing has the ability to resonate at a very almost simplistic level, and then also have that other part, is like any good book that way too. So I think that Trojan horse that I talk about, you ultimately need to sell the thing. You came up with the mid-review too. You may have other agendas, but one of the agendas at the minimum has to be how you're going to sell it. Even if you believe that it also has a pill in it that is going to be good for the community to take, right? The peanut butter that makes the dog eat the pill. But maybe that's also, you can do something with that, and hopefully, the two things are not mutually exclusive, is what I'm saying.
I had a question about the 3-in-1 house.
Yes.
Appropriately, you spoke about it from the role of the architect.
Yeah.
But I was wondering, since being the client and then the occupant of it, what that's been like, relationship with the people who come into the house, the person who rents it.
To be honest, I think that the rental unit thing has worked out more successfully than the office thing has. I think because there's a little bit too much communication between the office, meaning not enough control of that adjacency as is necessary, and so that's not been as successful. I think that sometimes that friction needs to be more carefully modulated. I think at that point I didn't really. Some things need to be tested in order to be understood, and at that point I was speculating as to how it would work. So some things like the bookshelf and the door work very well, but the fact that the office opens to, that swing space I was talking about, the dining room and the conference room, that's a form of contestation that hasn't been as successful as I would have, hoped in theory that it would be. It's, more of an acoustical kind of thing. So the hour, yeah. But I still believe in the project of contingency and about the kind of 24/7 thing where if you manage the clock and you work within what I call a fixed sum game, where there's only a finite set of resources and everybody's got to figure out how to get along to work out their piece of the pie, that there's tremendous richness in for the architect and actually figuring out how that can be formally productive. Yeah.
Your own house and your own project there, you can push the envelope in terms of where the building starts and ends in terms of the site.
Yeah.
How did you tweak the vehicle? I mean, oftentimes in this climate, and I'm not sure about Los Angeles, you got to be able to get the vehicle in and out, house it.
You mean the car?
The car.
Yeah, I didn't really talk about that, but the car comes down the other side of the house, and actually one of the shapes of the house was the fact that the car carves down a driveway envelope that undercuts the house and shapes the underside of the house, and actually shapes even the in plan as well, the turning radius of the car into the bottom tier of the back of the landscape. The car drives all the way down to the back of the property, down a hill, and the house hangs out above it. So that's another kind of form of contamination that's interesting, which is to find that your car is in your backyard is interesting, because then the place where it should be most private suddenly is where it's the most public. And we have our front door is actually the door coming up from the back, which is of course very Angelino, if those of you know how you go into stores there. But it's kind of topsy-turvy, has a really interesting impact on how the house operates, because it destabilizes all of the givens of domestic architecture and enables you to kind of come up with new ways of doing things.